Hello, I'm so happy to be here with all of you today to discuss what is admittedly kind of a gross topic, factory farm biogas, but it's also a very important topic and a very important issue. I'm going to be talking about it through the lens of one particular pollution trading scheme, and that is the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard. But that's not to say there are not other pollution trading schemes. I'm just kind of using the lens of California's low carbon fuel standard because that's what I've done the most work on. And it is a really good example of how the government is incentivizing the production of factory farm biogas. So before I dive in, just want to say that these are my personal views and opinions and that they are not necessarily representative of those of the Animal Legal Defense Fund or any of our clients. And I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge all the wonderful folks I've been working with on this issue. ALDF, or the Animal Legal Defense Fund, is very lucky to have wonderful coalition partners who are fighting factory farm biogas with us in California, and they're listed there on the screen. And there are also a lot of other incredible organizations and people fighting it across the country. This is definitely a nationwide problem. There are a lot of environmental justice communities fighting it, particularly in North Carolina, but also in other places. So just want to give a huge shout out to all of these folks. Some of them have been doing this work for a decade. So it's been ongoing for quite some time, and we're very excited to be a part of it. So here's a little roadmap of what we're going to be talking about today. First, we have to talk about factory farming and what it is. Then we'll talk about its impacts. As you can see there are quite a number of them. There are also a lot of questions about why this is happening. So we're going to be talking about how they get away with this, and that's basically how they remain unregulated. Then we'll talk about factory farm biogas, what it is, just the basics, 101 kind of stuff. And then I'll tell you about the government programs that are making it profitable to produce factory farm biogas, in particular, California's low carbon fuel standard. I'll also talk about our coalition's advocacy on this issue in California. I'll also talk about our coalition's advocacy in California on this issue. And then I'll leave you with some ideas for regulation and real reform of factory farming, which is, of course, our goal. So factory farms are also called CAFOs, and that stands for Concentrated Animal Feeding Operations, which is a term that is taken from Clean Water Act regulations. And I've cited it there if you're interested to take a look. These are industrial facilities where hundreds and sometimes even thousands of animals are kept and raised in extreme confinement. They do have a lot of differences from location to animal species and that sort of thing, but they do have some common characteristics. And that includes that generally the feed is brought to the animals, so they're not outdoors grazing. They have very little physical space most of the time. Many of them spend their entire lives indoors, particularly pigs and birds. They really don't have any opportunities to engage in natural behaviors, so they're not going to have access to dirt to scratch in sometimes, or if they're pigs, they will not have access to mud holes. And they do face mutilation and abuse and neglect, unfortunately, in addition to all of the other harms that they face in these facilities. And they live there until they are big enough to be taken to the slaughterhouse. And in terms of environmental harm, most of the environmental harm comes from this decision that the industry makes to liquefy manure, and that's how they manage it. And they make this decision because it is the cheapest and therefore the most profitable decision. And so that's why a lot of these things happen that we're going to be talking about today. So this is a factory farm in North Carolina. This is a pig factory farm. On the left, you can really get a sense of how big it is. These are warehouses that the animals are housed in. And if you look closely at the top left corner, you'll see some vehicles parked outside. So these are massive facilities. The animals are indoors in these windowless warehouse type buildings, standing on wooden flooring, and it's slatted so that their waste can fall through the slats and is then mixed with water and pumped into what the industry calls a lagoon. And you can see those on the right-hand side of your screen. These are essentially giant cesspools, just basically holes in the ground that they pump all the waste into, and the waste decomposes or rots there anaerobically, which means it doesn't have very much oxygen. So this is, again, the source of many of the environmental harms that are associated with factory farming. This is also a factory farm. This is a dairy factory farm in the Central Valley of California, and it does look quite a lot different from the one in North Carolina that we just saw. But there are a lot of things that are the same. Primarily the manure lagoon, as you can see on the bottom of your screen there. This is, again, just a cesspool. The industry calls it a lagoon as a euphemism. And all of the waste from the dairy cows, who you can see standing above on those kind of very barren looking pieces of land, all of the waste is flushed into here, just like from before. So very different kind of CAFO, but a very similar waste management system or waste mismanagement system. I also want to make a note, this is a little bit grainy because it's a screenshot from a wonderful video. Tom France made it from the Association of Irritated Residents, which is one of our wonderful coalition partners. And I've linked to that video if you want to see it. It's drone footage of this CAFO and of the biogas production process, so it's very educational. And while I'm at it, the Animal Legal Defense Fund also made a wonderful video that is narrated by Joaquin Phoenix, and that is also linked at the end of this presentation. Both of these videos are great resources. Ours is quite a good explainer video of exactly what happens to the biogas and why it's problematic. So highly, highly recommend both of those. They're at the end of the presentation if you want more info. Even though the lagoons are massive, sometimes the size of football fields or even bigger, they still do get full. And when that happens, the CAFO operators spray the waste on what are called spray fields. And that's what this is a photo of right here. And as you can see, it kind of turns into an aerosol as it's being sprayed on this field, which is problematic for a lot of reasons. It smells terrible, creates a lot of odors in communities that are occupied by factory farms. It carries in the wind. You can see it has kind of a mist quality to it. And this is just being sprayed on what looks to be some kind of grass in this case, probably Bermuda grass. And the reason is it's just there to soak up the waste. That's the whole purpose of this field. So that's what happens when these lagoons, again, a euphemism, get too full, and it causes a lot of issues. In terms of environmental harms, we have a lot of water pollution that this causes. So there's a lot of pollutants that are in manure, and that includes things like nitrates and phosphate and ammonia, metals, pharmaceutical chemicals, hormones, and antibiotics, which are given to the animals to keep them, from getting sick because they're smashed together in close quarters, and to make them grow as fast as possible because that is most profitable for this industry. And they also include parasites and bacteria and viruses, all kinds of things that can even cause zoonotic diseases like COVID. Even though COVID did not originate in a factory farm, the next virus just may. So that's something for us to keep in mind. So most of those lagoons that you saw are unlined, or they have earthen liners, so maybe like a clay liner or something like that. And so they do contaminate the groundwater beneath, and that includes the drinking water supplies. And the spray fields that you saw are saturated, often oversaturated, which causes the waste to run off into surface waters, and it also pollutes groundwater. Again, a huge issue for drinking water wells, especially in rural communities where community members tend to rely on private water wells for drinking water. And the public health impacts are significant. You have nausea, vomiting, fever, diarrhea, kidney failure, sometimes even death. And one particularly disturbing health impact is what is called blue baby syndrome, which is a blood disorder that occurs when the nitrates in the water interfere with the blood's capacity to carry oxygen. And this condition is so named because the infants do actually turn blue because they're not getting enough oxygen. So very serious impacts on health from water pollution. The majority of this presentation is going to be talking about air pollution and biogas, which is kind of made from the air pollution. So I'll get to that in a minute, but these pollutants are very dangerous. So first, let's talk about ammonia, volatile organic compounds, particulate matter, hydrogen sulfide. All of these air emissions, these air pollutants are quite dangerous. They really degrade local air quality, can cause very severe health impacts, as you can see here on this chart. Studies show that CAFO-occupied communities tend to have disproportionate levels of a lot of different illnesses, particularly respiratory issues, asthma, things like that, and all of these other things as well. And this is becoming very well documented, not only in North Carolina, but across the country where there are CAFOs really disproportionately in a community. Last year, this study came out that really tried to quantify the air quality related health damages of food production. And what it found, number one, is that there are 15,900 deaths annually in America from food-related fine particulate matter. And it also found that 80% of those are attributed to animal-based foods. So this is a chart that kind of breaks that down visually for you so you can see the proportion here. So all food production produces emissions, even plant-based foods, but you can see 12,700 of those people died from animal agriculture. So this is a really outsized proportion of the air pollution that is killing Americans. So those are kind of the health impacts of the air pollution. There's also some serious climate impacts. So there are two major greenhouse gases that factory farms produce. The first is methane, which is 25 times more potent at trapping heat in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide over a 100-year period. Methane, we're going to talk about later on as well, because it is a primary constituent in factory farm biogas. So that's the primary gas that makes up factory farm biogas. But factory farms also emit nitrous oxide, which is almost 300 times more powerful at trapping heat in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide over a 100-year period. So these are very, very dangerous gases that are very much fueling the climate crisis. And scientists are starting to really be able to quantify this in ways that they hadn't before. So if you look here on the left, you'll see all of these red and orange and yellow dots in the Central Valley in California. That is where all of these dairy CAFOs tend to be located. On the right, you can see that we can map methane coming out of these facilities. And what this really should show you is that we should be talking about methane emissions from animal agriculture in the same breath that we talk about them from oil and gas and other sectors that everyone recognizes that produce these terrible emissions. So on this pie chart, you see that 30% of the methane emissions in the US come from the natural gas and petroleum system. But what you don't maybe notice immediately is that 37%, even more than natural gas and petroleum, are coming from the animal agriculture industry. If you look on the left-hand side, you'll see 10% is coming from manure management, and 27% is coming from enteric fermentation. And enteric fermentation is a process that occurs in some farmed animals' digestive systems, and it causes them to emit methane from their bodies. So if you add these two things together, you come up with 37%, which is even more than natural gas and petroleum. But because of the power of the animal agriculture industry politically, the government is very hesitant to regulate it or even identify it as the source of these pollutants, as you can see from this pie chart. The information is there, but it doesn't stand out to you like the natural gas and petroleum system emissions do. So that's just something to really notice, because at the end of the day, the government really is very hesitant to regulate this industry and instead tends to give them voluntary measures to do in lieu of actual regulation. This is going to be a theme throughout, so take notice of that. So before we move on, I wanted to touch on the economic and quality of life impacts as well. There are a lot of unpleasant effects of living by a factory farm. All of the horrible odors from all of the manure in the air. There's insect vectors of things like flies and mosquitoes and gnats. There's also a lot of truck traffic, and this is because they're using semi-trucks to haul the animals to the factory farms when they're babies, and then to the slaughterhouse when they are big enough to be slaughtered. Just a point here, they're still babies at that time. They are very, very young when they reach slaughter weight. But what this means is that this truck traffic is generally happening at night because the industry knows that you and I don't like to see animals being hauled around because we know where they're going. So they do it at night, which means that people who live in these communities occupied by CAFOs tend to have a lot of light pollution and noise pollution at night from these trucks. And they're also tearing up the roads because these are country roads in many cases that are really not well equipped to withstand this kind of traffic. This can have serious impacts on property value, as you might imagine. Folks really don't want to live next to something like this. Properties that are within 0.1 miles of a factory farm decrease in value by as much as 88%. This is a huge problem because that causes the entire local economy in these rural communities to be hollowed out. People want to move and they can't because their house is no longer worth any money because nobody else wants to live near a factory farm either. It also means that they don't have enough tax revenue anymore to fix those potholes created by the truck traffic. So this is a really vicious circle that has horrible impacts on these communities. And not all communities are affected equally. This is a very important thing for us to recognize. Factory farms, like other polluting industries, are sources of environmental injustice. And environmental injustice, as quoted here, is when communities of color, which are often poor, are routinely targeted to host facilities that have negative environmental impacts. And here we see landfills, dirty industrial plants, truck depots, but also factory farms. And the reason why this happens is because these communities have less political power due to racism and other injustice to prevent these sorts of facilities from being located in their communities. And so that's why they're sought out by these industries, because it's easier to site their polluting facilities there. This is also true in the Central Valley of California, where there are many, many dairy CAFOs. These two wonderful organizations have noted that government agencies have repeatedly avoided regulating agricultural sources of pollution, even though the impacts of those decisions disproportionately fall on surrounding communities of color. And they have noted things like, disproportionately high levels of childhood asthma in these locations. The Central Valley has some of the worst air quality in the entire country, in large part due to these dairy CAFOs. So after all of that, you're probably asking yourself how factory farms get away with it. And that's a very big question, but I'm just going to talk about a couple of environmental laws and how they kind of avoid being regulated under these laws, even though technically they should be regulated. The first is the Clean Water Act. The goal of the Clean Water Act is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. One of the ways it does this is through the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES. It administers the effluent or waste limitations in the Act, and it prohibits the discharge of pollution from point sources into waters of the United States without a permit issued by the EPA or a qualified state. So this means that if a facility, like a factory farm, has a permit, then it is allowed to discharge within the parameters of the effluent limitations and may be also subject to monitoring and reporting requirements under the permit. The good news is that CAFOs are point sources, and this means that they're required to get a NPDES permit under the CAFO rule, but only when they're already discharging pollution into waters of the United States. This is the consequence of a lot of bad case law, essentially, a lot of bad court decisions that really weakened this. So now very few of them have individual NPDES permits, and others are covered under these state general permits, which are, they don't have individual requirements for particular CAFOs. All the CAFOs just kind of register to that permit, and they unsurprisingly don't do a very good job of regulating factory farms. There are also exceptions in the Act for agriculture. The primary one is the agricultural stormwater discharge exemption. And basically what that says is that if you spray manure on a spray field, and then it rains and washes all that manure that you just sprayed into a nearby waterway, perhaps a creek next door or something like that, it's not a violation of the Clean Water Act, so long as you're following your permit. So in addition to these issues, noncompliance is rampant and enforcement is dismal. Lack of reliable data is a huge problem, but also so is resistance to efforts to get it. So again, we run into this problem of the government just really not wanting to regulate this industry because it's politically unpopular. The Clean Air Act has a similar situation when it comes to factory farms, although I think a little bit worse. So the goal of the Clean Air Act is to protect and enhance the quality of the nation's air resources in order to promote public health and welfare. This sounds great because we heard about all of those terrible health impacts that are caused by the pollution from factory farming. This seems like a great fix. And indeed, the Clean Air Act does regulate many of the pollutants that CAFOs emit, things like criteria pollutants and hazardous air pollutants. And it does have permits and reporting requirements that apply to the largest CAFOs. This is under Title V, greenhouse gas reporting. But despite that, EPA and the states have only exercised their authority over CAFOs a few times under the Clean Air Act. They claim that it's too difficult and time consuming, and they tend to focus on other industries instead. They also claim a lack of good data. More about that in a moment. So there's this pending legislation that is a really good example of how this could actually get worse. So under the Livestock Regulatory Protection Act, it would remove EPA's ability to regulate factory farming under the Clean Air Act through Title V permitting. So this is something to keep an eye on. And again, a really good example of this industry doing anything it can to avoid regulation. There's also a theme of voluntary measures, and this one is probably one of the most egregious. So another thing that is weakening the Clean Air Act when it comes to factory farms is this National Air Emissions Monitoring Study and Voluntary Air Consent Agreement. Want to underscore the word voluntary yet again. This is a 2005 agreement between the Bullsh EPA and the animal agriculture industry. And the proffered objective here was to engage in this air emissions monitoring study to get data on air emissions that are coming out of CAFOs, which EPA would then be able to use to develop emission estimating methodologies to regulate this industry. But a big red flag is that this industry proposed and funded the study. And in the consent agreement, EPA agreed not to sue participating CAFOs for certain past and ongoing violations of the Clean Air Act and some other environmental laws as well. Almost 14,000 CAFOs signed up, but only 20 ended up being monitored. But even though only 20 were monitored, all the ones that signed up got immunity. Hence the Michael Scott GIF that you see here. Again, this is a very good example of how the industry has been very successful in making sure that these laws do not apply to it, even though they do. So voluntary, very key word here. We're going to talk more about voluntary measures in the context of factory farm biogas in a moment. And here we are. So before we do that, let's talk about the basics of factory farm biogas. Basically, what we're talking about is all the gases that come off of those lagoons, as they call them, being captured instead of being vented to the atmosphere. And so there's a lot of different gases in this mixture, but mainly we're talking about methane and carbon dioxide. So basically, biogas is that captured gas that is prevented from escaping into the atmosphere. I've talked a little bit about language already in the terms of lagoons and how that's a euphemism for cesspool that the industry puts out there to try to make its business practices less egregious sounding. And this is also true for factory farm biogas. Biogas itself is an industry term that is intended to make this process and this product sound green and environmentally friendly. Same thing for renewable natural gas and biomethane. These are all versions of the same thing. So I think language is really powerful and really important. So I want to flag this so that you know what to look for, because otherwise it sounds very innocuous and even good. So that's really important to train your ear to listen for things like this. So this is the biogas production process. And I just want to note before I dive into it that this came from a pretty industry-friendly source. So I'm going to have a few caveats to it, but I think it's a good example. It's simplified enough that it makes sense. On the left, you have the animals. Of course, they produce manure. That manure is put into what is called an anaerobic digester. It also might be called a methane digester. It's the same thing. And that's just a piece of equipment that takes this gas out and kind of, captures it. So two things come out of the digester: biogas at the top there, which can be used for heat and electricity and vehicle fuel and things like that, and then digestate. So one important thing to note is that raw manure goes into the digester and digestate comes out, and they're chemically different because it's a chemical process that occurs. And this, according to this source, it can be used for livestock bedding and fertilizer and soil amendments, but in reality, what tends to happen most often is that it's spread on land, just like manure. So it's a waste product. Here's what a methane digester looks like. There are many, many different kinds. These are very large, probably taking manure from quite a lot of factory farms, so that sometimes they're kind of clustered in areas around gigantic digesters like this. But they can also look like just tarps over lagoons. We see this a lot. This is from a very large dairy CAFO in the Central Valley of California. And as you can see, it's just basically a glorified tarp spread over a lagoon. So there are some problems with methane digesters, the pieces of equipment that capture this gas. First, think back to that pie chart that we talked about. The first issue is that it can only capture methane from manure management. And as you remember, that's only 10% of US emissions of methane. The enteric emissions, which are 27%, it can't capture those. So those are still just, those are just going out into the atmosphere. They also produce this digestate. As I noted, it's chemically different. It's distinguished from manure. Raw manure and digestate are very different chemically. And one of the ways that they're different is that digestate has higher levels of ammonia and nitrous oxide than raw manure. And as you recall, nitrous oxide is a very, very powerful greenhouse gas, I think 300 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. So these emissions do undercut the purported benefits of methane capture in the first place. In addition to that, they don't do anything to address other forms of factory farm pollution. They don't help with environmental injustice. They do nothing to address animal welfare issues. And really, you can package all of those things under one heading that is basically just that it's not reforming the factory farm system. We need to fix the system and stop letting it do all of these very environmentally destructive things that hurt communities. And of course, they're hurting animals at the same time. But instead of reforming, this is just kind of entrenching the worst problems, because they usually, as you can see right down here, they rely mainly on liquid manure. So we're, again, really kind of digging our heels in on reforming this industry and instead allowing it to continue going along with business as usual and even making it profitable. More about that in a minute. So in addition to those issues, they also require a lot of energy to operate, which is of course not green, and they're exorbitantly expensive to construct and maintain. On average, they cost $5 million just to install. This is why they're really only feasible on the largest factory farms, the biggest polluters. They leak emissions and manure, and they can even explode. And I have some examples of that. This is from a CAFO in North Carolina, and it's really overwhelming to see all of this disgusting sludge everywhere. You can see the methane digester there. It ruptured in the background, kind of that tarpy looking thing. But if you look closely at the fence post, you can see just how much waste is here. So this thing basically exploded, and 37,000 gallons of manure was discharged to waterways from this spill. Same thing in Iowa. This one released over 300,000 gallons to waterways. So they present additional environmental harms on top of the ones that we were already seeing from factory farming. So in addition to the problems with the methane digesters themselves, there's also problems with the system more broadly. So it's combusted just like fossil natural gas, so it makes its way into the atmosphere anyway. It's usually burned for something like transportation fuels instead of just being vented into the atmosphere. But at the end of the day, it's still combusted. In addition, it has to be processed at a refinery, much like oil, before it can be used for most purposes like transportation. And this means that it requires all kinds of fossil natural gas pipelines and trucks and other infrastructure for transportation. And these are not environmentally friendly things. This is a very dirty industry. And I put some logos down here. And so far, I've only talked really about one industry, and that's the animal agriculture industry. But if you look at the relationship that this industry has with the natural gas industry and the fossil industry, you'll see that it really is a bit of an unholy alliance. Both of these industries are working together to produce factory farm biogas because it is so lucrative right now. And so all of these industries are benefiting from the government subsidies and other things that they are getting from producing this gas. So that's something to keep in mind. It's not just animal agriculture, it's also this other dirty fossil industry that is trying to avoid regulation, trying to greenwash itself. Both of these industries are doing the same thing. They're trying to survive in a world where everyone is kind of coming to terms with the fact that climate change is happening and that these industries are causing it. So one of the ways they're doing it is by taking advantage of the many government sources of money that are going to factory farm gas producers. And I don't have time to go into all of them, but I just wanted to throw some up there for examples. So on the federal side, there are a lot of capital costs associated with producing factory farm biogas. As you recall, one methane digester costs on average $5 million to install. They can get money for that from USDA through these programs with USDA, REAP and EQIP especially. There's also these credit pollution trading schemes, like California's low carbon fuel standard, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But there's also this federal renewable fuel standard that functions similarly. And then there's also other funding just in various pieces of legislation. The most recent is the Inflation Reduction Act, which provided many tax credits to this industry. On the state side, there are also programs that help with funding there. I've focused on California, but other states also have programs. The California Department of Food and Agriculture has this Dairy Digester Research and Development Program, which funds digesters, capital construction. They also have the Public Utilities Commission running this dairy biomethane pilot project, which actually covers pipeline infrastructure for these factory farm gas producers, among other things. And then you also have credit systems like the low carbon fuel standard, which I'm going to talk about, in addition to cap and trade. And one thing to note is that other states are also building out similar programs based on California's, because California's are first and just the most popular and the most widespread. So we're going to continue to see these things proliferate, and it's unfortunate because as they do, factory farm biogas also will proliferate. So let's talk about the low carbon fuel standard and how it's making this process so profitable. So it's a regulation that the California Air Resources Board adopted in 2009. It's been in place since 2011. And it has a goal of reducing the carbon intensity of transportation fuels in California by displacing those fuels with low carbon alternative transportation fuels. So displacing things like gasoline and diesel with more, low carbon alternative fuels. And the bedrock principle of the low carbon fuel standard is that the carbon intensity of each fuel has to be calculated by analyzing all of the emissions associated with its production. We're talking cradle to grave. Every single thing that goes into making this fuel is supposed to be considered. And this is called the life cycle analysis. Each fuel is given a carbon intensity score based on the life cycle analysis, and that determines how many credits it's worth on the market. It also kind of is intended to reflect how green it is. So there are regulated entities under the low carbon fuel standard, like petroleum importers and refiners and wholesalers, and they have to reduce the carbon intensities of their products by, whatever way necessary. But one way they can do that is by offsetting their emissions. And so these are deficit generators. They need to reduce their emissions or offset them. Those are their options under the low carbon fuel standard. Other entities, though, like factory farms, are not regulated under the low carbon fuel standard, but they can still participate by producing this purportedly low carbon intensity fuel to displace those higher carbon fossil fuels in the transportation sector. And those are called credit generators. So we'll see this relationship between credit generators and deficit generators. It's supposed to, and they're engaging with each other on the market. So the low carbon fuel standard is coming out of the Global Warming Solutions Act of 2006, which is a landmark law in California. And it requires the California Air Resources Board to do two things in relation to the low carbon fuel standard. First, it requires the board to ensure that the LCFS will result in real emission reductions. And what that means is that these emissions, the reductions have to be real. They can't be cooking the books or accounting tricks or anything like that. This program has to result in emission reductions that are real. The second issue is that they're responsible for ensuring that the low carbon fuel standard will result in additional emission reductions. And that is reductions that are not already required by law or otherwise would have occurred. So the takeaway here is that it has to be the reason why the emission reductions happen. They wouldn't have happened without the low carbon fuel standard. That's the requirement. Unfortunately, the low carbon fuel standard does not live up to this. It really lacks programmatic integrity. First, the emission reductions are not real. So this happens because factory farm biogas generates way more credits per megajoule than it should, because the faulty life cycle analysis essentially makes it look greener than it really is. And the way that happens is that they're not looking at the upstream or downstream emissions in this cradle to grave life cycle analysis as they're required to, and as they do for other fuels. So for example, it doesn't include enteric emissions. As you remember, that's 27% of methane emissions in the United States. It also doesn't include things like nitrous oxide emissions that result because of the chemical process involved in digesting this manure, let alone the emissions associated with feed production for the animals. We're talking about animal manure here. Obviously, you have to feed the animals to produce the manure. That should be included, and it's not. In addition, the emission reductions are not additional as they're required to be. So these purported emission reductions are being double and sometimes even triple counted. This happens because CARB and other agencies claim the same purported emission reductions for different programs at the same time. So for example, maybe there is a factory farm participating in the low carbon fuel standard, generating credits and selling them for a profit. And at the same time, they have a digester that the California Department of Food and Agriculture funded for them. So that means that CARB and the California Department of Food and Agriculture are counting these emission reductions at the same time. It's the same emission reductions. They already would have happened essentially. So CARB is crediting these purported emission reductions that would have occurred anyway, which they're not supposed to be doing. And this is a really helpful, I think, graphic of understanding the implications of this. And I totally understand this is a very technical topic. It's complicated. This graph has really helped me understand it a little bit better. And this graph represents the carbon intensity of a bunch of different renewable natural gas feedstocks, as the California Air Resources Board calls them. So if you look, the red one, the red dot, has a score of 95. It's positive. So its carbon intensity is a positive intensity, which means that it's carbon positive, which is not a good thing. So it has a 95. The interesting one to me is the RNG food and green waste, the green dot, which has a negative carbon intensity. So that's good. It's good to have a negative one of negative 15, modest, but still negative. But then if you look over here on the left, you see factory farm biogas has a negative 310. And I've actually seen some much higher than that. This is obviously absurd. And the reason why is because, again, they're not looking at any of the things that make factory farm biogas so bad for the environment. They're not looking at the enteric emissions. They're not looking at all of these things. So this is how this happens. And this is, I think, a good visual representation of how it happens. And it has serious consequences on the market. So this gas is so very profitable, and they're taking note. Marty Myers was the manager of 3 Mile Canyon Farms, which, if you haven't heard of it, is the biggest CAFO in the United States. It has 70,000 cows. It's a dairy CAFO. And he said the most valuable product that we have out there is natural gas. And then Steve Shahidi over at Bar 20 Dairy in the Central Valley, he said, we used to joke about how funny it would be if we could make more money off the poop than the milk, and now we're essentially here. And then you have David Fisher from the New York Farm Bureau saying, dairy margins are really tight. So if we can get some money out of a byproduct, that's a good thing. So a couple of things here. first thing to note is that the low carbon fuel standard is across the country. So even though it's a California regulation and a California program that the California Air Resources Board is administering, it is allowing CAFOs in other parts of the country to essentially sell their biogas on the market. So you'll have CAFOs in New York and Iowa, Minnesota, places all over. And so it's having this outsized effect on CAFOs all across America. It's causing them to see, hey, this is very profitable. Maybe we should think about producing energy in addition to, or maybe even instead of dairy products or animal products or whatever it is that they're making. And so the Wall Street Journal has also taken note, and they called it a gold rush in cow manure. So the low carbon fuel standard has made it so profitable to produce factory farm biogas that now everybody wants to produce manure, which before was a very big liability to factory farming. It was something that was a real thorn in their side, but now they're being incentivized to produce it, incentivized to produce something that is very polluting, bad for the environment, bad for communities, and it's incentivizing them to get bigger and more consolidated, which is of course terrible for all of those people and communities and also the animals because they're just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So it's really exacerbating environmental injustice, and the Union of Concerned Scientists has concluded that the low carbon fuel standard is likely contributing to industry consolidation, as I mentioned, and they warned that the largest polluter is the one receiving a large subsidy. So this is a really perverse policy decision that the California Air Resources Board has made. So expansion and consolidation of factory farms is being driven by these very lucrative low carbon fuel standard credits and is further burdening already overburdened communities. So again, factory farming is something we should be regulating, getting to the root of, and trying to reform. And instead, they're rewarding the biggest polluters among them for exactly the practices that make them so environmentally devastating, basically liquefied manure management. And the industry admits that it is consolidating. So we've seen these applications coming in from factory farm biogas producers who want to participate in the low carbon fuel standard. And one went so far as to say the quiet part out loud. They said, dairies have existed in California for decades, and the consolidation of herds to facilities with digesters should be encouraged in order to best make use of the infrastructure in place and maximize the benefits to the public. But we know that communities who are already occupied by factory farming do not want them to get bigger. They do not want them to install pipelines. They do not want them to be consolidated and expanding. They're already suffering from all of the pollution. Some of them don't have drinking water. They're breathing very polluted air. They have some of the worst air quality in the country. The last thing they need is for this industry to get bigger and badder in their communities. There's also one other wrinkle. So there's this consequence for environmental injustice, the factory farms getting bigger and more consolidated. But there's also this issue with those deficit generators that I mentioned. So these are the oil refineries and those sorts of industries. They're required to reduce their emissions or offset them with credits. So the overvalued factory farm biogas is allowing those sorts of industries to just keep polluting under the guise that their emissions are offset like they always did. And these emissions have a racially disparate impact. So we're talking about producing, oil and gas fuels, fossil fuels. CARB has acknowledged that it has a racially disparate impact, and this is ongoing. So these communities are not seeing the benefits of any of California's climate policies because these polluting industries just keep on with their same practices that they have always had. So let's wrap up quickly with the California Coalition's advocacy. We, again, have a wonderful coalition. It's been a real honor to work with all of these groups and folks who are involved. We filed this petition for rulemaking last year with the California Air Resources Board, asking them to remove factory farm biogas from the low carbon fuel standard, or at least try to make it so that it is not so overvalued that it's increasing factory farming. The agency did deny it, but they said that they would take a look at it and all of the issues that we raised in our petition when they engage in rulemaking for the low carbon fuel standard, which is set to be, I think, next year. So it's coming up. So we're hopeful that something will come out of that. We also filed a petition for reconsideration, which was also unfortunately denied. But we have continued our advocacy. We have commented on dozens and dozens of applications from factory farm biogas producers to participate in the low carbon fuel standard, and we are going to keep on working. I wanted to leave you with some ideas for some regulation and real reform, things that would actually address factory farming and all of the harms that it brings. First, obviously, we want to remove it from the California low carbon fuel standard and other pollution trading schemes like the federal renewable fuel standard. We also, to the extent it is not removed, should insist upon programmatic integrity by making sure that the emission reductions are real and additional. We should adopt and enforce command and control regulations of factory farm emissions. No more of this voluntary stuff. It's not working. We should enforce the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act and other environmental laws against factory farms. And we should end these subsidies from the USDA and other agencies like the California Department of Food and Agriculture for methane digesters and other infrastructure for factory farm biogas production. And we have to insist that climate change mitigation measures actually work and that they don't come at the expense of environmental justice communities. Finally, we need to pass the Farm System Reform Act, which will put a moratorium on large concentrated animal feeding operations in America. This was by Cory Booker, and it's something that would at least try to, we're trying to get our arms around this. And so that would be a place to start. And I'm sure there are a lot of other good ideas as well, and maybe we can talk about some of those in the Q&A. I put some resources and further information at the end of this, including that wonderful video that I mentioned that we did. It's the third bullet point there. It's a great explainer video with Joaquin Phoenix narrating. I've also included Tom Francis' video, second from the bottom. And that's it. I'm very excited to hear your questions.